Welcome to the EcoMinutes. This is Dr. Enid Siskin. The EcoMinutes is a longer and more comprehensive version of the EcoMinute, where I can spend a few minutes explaining details I can't do in a minute. Today, I'm in the WUWF studio with Christian Wagley, longtime environmental advocate and contributor to the EcoMinute, and one of my oldest friends in the area. We originally planned this interview around the Rice's whale, but unfortunately they've been in the news a lot lately and not in a good way. So we're also going to talk about the Endangered Species Committee, or so-called God Squad, and how their latest actions threaten wildlife in the Gulf, including the Rice's whale. Hi, Christian. Welcome. Can you tell a bit about yourself and your work, particularly around the Rice's whale?
Well, hey, Enid. I am grateful for the chance to be here with you. I always enjoy our visits. So I work for Healthy Gulf, which is a nonprofit organization that works on a variety of water, climate, energy, and endangered species issues across the Gulf Coast. We're based in New Orleans, but we have staff like me that work in all 5 Gulf states from Florida to Texas. I live here in Pensacola and work on a variety of issues, including whales. Yes, we have whales in the Gulf of Mexico, including Rice's whales and a number of others. And I've lived here in Pensacola a little over 30 years. Graduate of the University of West Florida, got my master's degree out here in biology and coastal zone studies.
Great. Well, you mentioned that there are other whales in the Gulf. What whales are there?
I mean, there's about 20 species of whales and dolphins. There are, a number of the whales that we might hear about, or sometimes we hear about whales that get what we call stranded. They come ashore, typically dead or dying. Short-fin pilot whales, melon-headed whales, sperm whales are probably one of the more common ones that we might hear about. And, of course, the one that's been so much in the news and really probably the last 5 years or so is the Rice's whale.
I understand that the Rice's whale has probably the fewest number of individuals of the Gulf whales. Are there estimates of just how many there are left?
The Rice's whale is one of the rarest in the world, and it's certainly the rarest in the Gulf. The best estimate is fewer than 100, maybe only around 50 individuals remaining. And interestingly, they really like it off Florida the most. So we have a place, and actually off Pensacola. We have a place out there. Yeah, we have a place out there called the DeSoto Canyon, which is a place, if you fish or fishermen, it's where they like to go for the pelagic fish like marlin and swordfish and wahoo and such. And the same things that attract those fish there are attracting the whales there to feed as well. So the DeSoto Canyon is about 60 miles out from Pensacola Pass. The whales, though, are found Gulf-wide, so they really like what they call the drop-off or the shelf break, so where the continental shelf drops off into the deeper waters of the Gulf. So this is going to be between about 300 and 1,300 feet in depth. That's where the whales like to be. That's where they're feeding. That's where they're pretty much spending all of their lives. And so that's pretty much from the Keys, wrapping all the way around to the Texas-Mexico border. And I say that, the whales don't know where the border is clearly, but there's been more research effort in the United States part of the Gulf. So we know a little bit more about what happens up here. There are, for example, listening devices out there that listen for whales, and that's retrieved, and then that's filtered through, and you can hear the whales and where they go. That type of research effort just hasn't quite happened yet off of Mexico. But the suitable habitat is there, and most likely there's some there as well. But their favorite spot is actually right here off Northwest Florida.
No kidding. I understand the Rice's whale was not necessarily identified as a unique species until fairly recently. So how did that happen?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. They were only named as the Rice's whale, as a fully distinct and new species 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago. Now, we knew the whales were there, right? So scientists have known about them since the 1960s, when one came ashore dying, stranded in the little town of Panacea, Florida, kind of over there south of Tallahassee in the Big Bend area. And at the time, a scientist found out about it, saw a newspaper article and photos of the whale, and thought, that whale should not be in the Gulf. What is going on here? Wrote a paper about it. That was Dale Rice, who was a whale biologist actually in the Pacific Northwest. So he gets credit. That's when they redid the renaming. They gave him credit for it. But for years and years, for decades, scientists were referring to it as the Brutus whale, which is a whale that ranges worldwide in temperate regions. And this was believed to be a subspecies of Brutus whale, so a little bit different, lived mainly or only in the Gulf of Mexico. But about 20 years ago, scientists were just thinking, this one seems to be different. We think there's some unique things about it, but science needs what? It needs evidence, and they didn't have enough evidence yet. And so what happened was one came ashore dead in the Everglades in, it was 2018, and that's a tragedy, because when you have so few animals, losing even one is a tragedy. But scientists saw the opportunity, and so they seized that opportunity. That whale was buried in a very methodical way, actually a specific mix of compost in order to get a clean skeleton. It was done first in Florida, and then it was taken to a place on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, or in the coastal area of North Carolina. They nicknamed it Bonehenge. I don't remember the exact name of it, but they specialize in this work. Whale and marine mammal carcasses are brought there and buried in a specific way to get that clean skeleton. So that was done. And the scientists were able to compare the skull of that specimen to other closely related whales, along with some new DNA analysis was done, and the paper was published, and both of those two lines of research said this is a fully distinct species, and it was renamed Rice's whale.
Cool. That's really interesting. You discussed where in the Gulf the Rice's whales generally live. What can you say about the habitat that far offshore?
When you get that far offshore, it's relatively devoid of nutrients. And so we can tell that from the color of the water. And I've only been out there once. That's 60 miles out. And it's a fascinating experience because close to shore, the water has that more greenish hue. We all know that when we go to the beach. That's why we call it the Emerald Coast. But scientists and anybody, once you learn it, can tell a lot by the color of water. And so the farther you go offshore, it just keeps getting bluer and bluer, and it becomes this just intense cobalt blue color. And that's really a reflection of low nutrient levels out there, as reflected by the lack of phytoplankton, right? The phytoplankton are capturing that energy in the sun, and they're little plants that are growing, and that's the base of that marine food chain out there. And there's very little of that offshore. And so you can tell that by the color of the water. Yet there is life out there, and there's a little bit more life along that shelf break or that edge, because you're getting some upwelling that's coming up and bringing nutrients from down deep along that edge. And there's just more activity there with fish and marine life. And the whales are there because the fish that they mostly target, which is called a silver rag driftfish. Nobody would know. Nobody's ever heard of that fish before. There's no commercial fishery for it, right? You're not going to find it in a restaurant somewhere. But that's mostly what the whales are targeting. And they're doing what's called plunge feeding. They're diving down hundreds of feet and lunging literally like through a school of fish with their mouth open and getting hundreds or thousands of fish at a time. And these little fish, and I say little, they're 5 or 6 inches long. These drift fish are very high in fat. And so we know fat is what? Fat is calories. Fat is energy. And so it's believed that the whales are willing to expend all that energy to go that far down to get these fish because it gives them a big return on that investment.
Now, whales have an interesting role in the ecology of the Gulf. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, this is being talked about and recognized more and more worldwide. So anywhere that we have whales that feed at depth, and there are those types of whales all over the world. Some whales feed at the surface, but these whales, like the Rice's whales, that feed at depth. So again, they're diving hundreds of feet down. They're getting those silver-eyed driftfish, and there's some other things they eat as well. And then they're returning to the surface, right? Because they have to be breathing every little bit. And so when they do that, they inevitably poop. They defecate at the surface. And so remember, we talked about the color of that water, and basically from a planktonic kind of nutrient level standpoint, it's almost like a desert in some ways out there. And so the whales are taking those nutrients in the form of fish that they're consuming and bringing that back to the surface and putting those nutrients out there when they defecate, and that's feeding that phytoplankton there that's the base of the food chain. And so because of the whales, they're literally pumping, that's where the name, the whale pump comes from, pumping nutrients that otherwise would just stay down there at the bottom, and they're pumping those and bringing those back up to the surface where they feed that plankton. So you get a richer environment when the whales are there, and that phytoplankton as a base of the food chain, that's feeding all these other things that are up there, ultimately the wahoo and the tuna and the marlin and all those other things that live there, and making it richer. And so the Gulf of Mexico, with the whales being in so low numbers, much lower than they ever would have been historically, although we don't know exactly what that number would have been, but there would have been far more. The Gulf is being robbed of that ecosystem service. That's what we call a service, right, that these systems provide. So the Gulf is not as rich as it should be without the whales there in the numbers that they should be.
So we've got a small population of Rice's whales, estimated to be between 50 and 100 individuals. What are the threats facing the species that is keeping the population so small?
Yeah, there are several main threats to Rice's whales, and some of these are same threats to whales in other parts of the world as well. One is ocean noise. So noise does not kill whales outright or directly, but it stresses them. And when an animal is stressed, it can't feed very well, it can't reproduce very well, it may shorten its life, it may not be able to have offspring. So ocean noise is largely created by vessel traffic, so shipping. And really the oil and gas industry in the Gulf is really the biggest single source of impacts to the whales, and it has those impacts in multiple ways. So one is just the noise of the operations, of drilling operations. One is called seismic surveys. This is what's done to find new areas for oil and gas, where they tow an array behind a ship and they fire thousands of explosions toward the bottom of the ocean and try to find these deposits. That's a terribly destructive, process, and noisy. And of course, this noise can travel over thousands of miles across the Gulf. Oil industry and oil and gas industry generates a lot of ship traffic, a lot of vessel traffic in the Gulf. And so these accidental ship strikes, whether it's from oil and gas or just general port shipping type stuff, is very much a threat to Rice's whales, and that's a leading cause of whale mortality worldwide. The other one is oil spills. And so we get frequent smaller events that may not be such an issue, but we get that occasional larger event. In the Gulf, there was the 79 Ixtoc spill, which was off Mexico. And of course, everybody here knows the 2010 BP disaster, which was catastrophic for the Gulf and for Florida. That's believed to have led to a 22% decline in the Rice's whale population. That's what NOAA reports. That's what the scientists report. And that's absolutely catastrophic. The population could certainly not handle that again.
I know you were active in an effort to create a ship slowdown zone in the Gulf to protect the Rice's whales. How would that have helped, and what happened?
Yeah, several years ago, Healthy Gulf joined with a number of national partners like Natural Resources Defense Council and brought forward a big body of science showing that ship strike is very much a threat to Rice's whales. And it's something where we can have some more immediate ability to do something about. So, for example, the oil and gas industry in the Gulf is probably there for a while yet, right? It's got a lot of inertia behind it. You know, it's not going to go away immediately. It will eventually go away as we transition to renewable energy, which is inevitable. But slowing down ships in areas where whales are most likely to be encountered is a proven conservation measure. It's been done on the East Coast for right whales, which range from Florida up into Canada. It's been done seasonally for those at port areas all on the East Coast since 2008. So we know it can be done. We know it's successful. Healthy Gulf and these national partners petitioned NOAA to do something like that in the Gulf. And NOAA rejected that. It's certainly politically a very much a hot potato. I think first time you bring forward a big idea, it sounds pretty outrageous, at the time, whether that's our personal lives or whether that's in this space of conservation. And so you have interests like the oil and gas industry, like ports and shipping, that had never heard of something like this before. It's never been done in the Gulf, and there was very, very strong pushback. I think, unfortunately, there was some misunderstanding. The way it's done on the East Coast, it only applies to vessels 65 feet and larger. So it really tries to target those larger and those commercial vessels and not a lot of the smaller, like the recreational, fisherman type. And then also, one of the things in our initial petition talked about no nighttime transits. And the reason was the science is behind that. The Rice's whales at night they're largely resting close to the surface within the draft depth of a ship. So they're extremely vulnerable because at least during the day when they're active and they're moving around, they're more visible. And both the whales and a ship can take some evasive action. But at night, when they're literally just resting close to the surface, they can't be seen, so no action can be taken by a ship. And the whales themselves are not in an active state where they can get out of the way. So they're extremely vulnerable. The difficulty is, shipping is a 24/7 operation, and the idea of stopping it at night is just not tenable at all for the industry. So those were some big points that were raised around that. It's still a proven conservation measure. I think it might come back at some point, but there's nothing imminent on that front, unfortunately.
But what other conservation measures might help the Rice as well?
Well, more restrictions on some of these seismic surveys. There are some newer technologies that are less intrusive in terms of these explosions that are generated and the sound impacts of that. And the industry's not fully adopted those yet. And so that is certainly something that could be done. And I think when you look at oil and gas, the Rice's whales are one bad oil spill away from extinction when you look at what happened in the 2010 BP disaster. And so right now we have, with a lot of changes, a lot of things going on in Congress and the president and the administration, there's a lot of effort toward deregulation. There's very much animosity toward adding any new regulations to oil and gas. And so that does make us particularly, vulnerable to potentially another spill like that.
There's something called critical habitat that is part of the recovery of an endangered species like the Rice's whale. What is critical habitat, and what is its status for Rice's whales?
Yeah, critical habitat is something that ends up being designated for every endangered plant or animal species that we're trying to recover. In the case of the Rice's whale, that designation of critical habitat is under court order. It's going to be delivered in the year 2027. There was litigation in order to force the federal government to do that. It's literally a map. And in the case of the Rice's whale, it shows the habitat for the Rice's whale as being everything in the Gulf of Mexico, the U.S. Gulf, between 100 and 400 meters in depth from the Florida Keys, wrapping all the way around the northern Gulf Coast down to the Texas-Mexico border. And so this does a couple of things. It gives us a better idea of really where the animals live and where they're likely to be found. But importantly, under the Endangered Species Act, it triggers a process within the federal government where if they are spending federal money or a permit is being issued that could affect that particular area, then the agencies are required to consult with each other and to talk to each other, and in the case of the Rice's whale, to decide if some special protective actions are needed to protect the whale from whatever that action might be.
What's being done to build support for the protection of the Rice's whale?
Well, there are a whole lot of things happening on that front. And, we're playing catch up a little bit because the whale's only been named as a new species 5 years ago. We don't have that tradition of kind of knowing and thinking about whales here on the Gulf Coast. So there's a couple things happening. One of the things that's happening more recently now is one of the issues is we don't see these whales very often. And for science, we need to know when they're seen and to have those reported. So we've been working to get signs placed at boat ramps and marinas where there are fishermen and others that go far offshore to report those sightings. It's really important for building the case, for the science of where the whales are and the seasonality and such. But I think the most important and most exciting thing for me is the Gulf Coast Whale Festival. We just had our third one out on Pensacola Beach, so we'll do it for the fourth time next year. And that's really building that whale culture here in just the most wonderful and fun way. I mean, it's a festival out there at the main beach on Pensacola Beach with a lot of education and live music and speakers and hands-on art activities going on. And one of the coolest things is the Navarre Beach Marine Science Station, which is this wonderful program of Santa Rosa County Schools. Charlene Morrow is the teacher there. They actually have a life-size inflatable Rice's whale now that's 30 feet long. And then the kids can actually crawl through the inside, and you actually see some of the internal organs and structure inside the whale, and it is the biggest hit in the world. And this is bringing to life this whale that most of us are probably never going to see, right? They're just too rare right now. They live too far offshore. And so the Whale Festival is just so much fun to come together in this way, and again, use art, education, hands-on stuff, music, all of that. We have a local guy who's crafted a song about Rice's whales, and he sings that every year. Kids come forward and they do a little pledge to be good stewards of marine life, and they get a little whale charm for doing that. And it just builds every year organically. This year was amazing because there's some surfers here who went to the Whale Festival last year and had such a great time. And they said, what can we do to support this? And then they thought, well, we're surfers. We'll have a surf competition. So it became the Spicy Ricey longboard competition because the scientific name of Rice's whale is Ricei, and they just took it from that. So they had that at the same time as the Whale Festival this year, had a very successful surf competition and raised money for Healthy Gulf to put back into that whale conservation work. And so that's an example of how these things just grow organically as more people hear about the whales. They take it upon themselves to do something. And I just think it's a beautiful example of how humans have the ability to care about something even that they may never see. And I think about myself growing up. I loved big cats. I loved lions. I loved tigers. Well, I've never been to Africa. I've never been to India. I've never seen them in their wild, and I probably never will. But I still care about them, and I still love them. And it's the same thing with Rice's whales.
So how well attended is the Whale Festival?
Yeah, we get a couple of thousand people there, and part of it is by having it at that very busy part of the beach. You reach a lot of people, too, that wouldn't necessarily know about the event and weren't there necessarily for that. They come over and just see a good time happening, and they get exposed to it as well, and especially the parents and the kids, because there's all kinds of fun stuff for the kids to do. And so it's just a great, wholesome event, and again, it's just part of that building that whale culture here, which just builds more every year.
We'll try to get a picture. Maybe we can put it on this story.
I can get you one.
You can do that. We'll put it on the website. So now, the God Squad. Can you tell me what they are and what's going on with them right now, and particularly how it affects the Rice's whale?
So there is this pretty much little-known provision in the Endangered Species Act that was put in the late 70s, which, the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, and at some point Congress recognized or thought that there might be a need for some occasional, very rare exception made to the Endangered Species Act. And so there's a committee that is, it's structured under the law, made up of different cabinet level positions. It's, Department of the Interior and Secretary of Defense and NOAA and a few others. And it's been nicknamed the God Squad because they've literally been given the power to potentially decide whether a species lives or dies based on these actions. And so there's the ability under the law to provide an exception to endangered species laws for economic reasons. And that was done for, say, a dam in Tennessee back in the late 1970s. This only happened a couple times in the whole
I think it's happened only
nearly 50 years. Yeah,
only 3 times have this committee gotten together to make decisions.
Yeah.
And in many cases, they haven't actually agreed to it.
That's correct. So this was a historic thing. We knew that this provision exists, but just didn't expect it to be used or hadn't been thinking about it being used, had not foreseen that. But at the end of March, that committee, which is actually called the Endangered Species Committee, convened at the Department of the Interior headquarters in Washington, D.C., upon the request of Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. And the Secretary of Defense made a request that oil and gas operations in the Gulf of Mexico needed to be exempted from having to comply with the Endangered Species Act, from having to protect over 20 species of endangered wildlife in the Gulf for national security reasons. And really it has to do with being able to have enough oil and gas. And this is done, in the backdrop of the Iran war going on. But interestingly, what the Secretary of Defense brought forward as a reason was environmental groups like Healthy Gulf, like a number of others, using litigation to try to make sure that the oil industry follows the law in the Gulf was actually the national security threat. And that's actually the very novel argument that was brought forward and the reason for that they requested the exception.
And unfortunately, they got that exception.
Yeah, the committee members, I mean, it was a 16-minute long meeting, rather sloppily done. When you compare it to the other times this committee has been convened over the years, I think it's like only 3 times. And in each case, there was a very large body of science and information brought forward to build the case for why this exception was needed. That was not done in this case. Very little documentation provided. In other instances, there were multiple hearings held. In one instance, it did not end up going forward, but the process moved forward over a couple of years. It didn't happen in the end. Was around spotted owls in Oregon back in the early 1990s, and that had multiple public hearings actually in Oregon, so actually out in the field where the issue was. So that didn't happen in this case. They didn't build the case. They didn't really provide the documentation. It was rather hastily done. Hopefully, probably that makes it somewhat vulnerable in court. And so Healthy Gulf, along with other national partners, are part of one lawsuit challenging this, along with, I think there are 2 other lawsuits as well from other groups, so a total of 3 lawsuits. And those have been filed right away to challenge this exemption. And by the way, I mentioned 20 species in the Gulf. Let's talk about what some of those are. That's things like 5 species of sea turtles, which I think all of which, maybe but one, will come up on our beaches here in Northwest Florida. It's Gulf sturgeon that come through our bays and migrate up our rivers. It's, of course, the Rice's whales. There's a couple species of corals in the mix there. Sawfish are in that, and a couple of other species of fish. But again, around or a little over 20 species in the Gulf that oil and gas now, as of the end of March, do not have to take any special actions to protect.
NOAA recently announced a status review on the Rice's whale. What does that mean?
So status review is something that is normally can be done every 5 years or so to take another look at a protected species and decide if its classification needs to be adjusted. So species are designated as threatened or designated as endangered. And this triggers a scientific review process where scientists look at the latest information, latest data on a particular species and can make a few different determinations. They can continue to keep the animal where they are as a threatened or endangered species. They can delist it lower and take it from an endangered species to threatened, or take it off the list altogether if they determine that it's been recovered. And so that has been triggered now for the Rice's whale. We are a little bit suspect of kind of the process behind that. There was a hearing on Capitol Hill in the U.S. Senate where a U.S. Senator from Alabama, Katie Britt, was asking questions of Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. NOAA's under Commerce Secretary. And there was a line of questioning kind of pushing on this issue that Rice's whales may not be a distinct species, that they needed to do a scientific review of that. And immediately this process was initiated within probably 2 weeks of that.
Well, that's concerning. I wonder if what's going to happen with that.
Well, I think as long as the science is honored and the political appointees don't mess with the science, then I'm optimistic that we'll be fine. The science that led to the designation of the Rice's whale as a distinct species used 2 different independent lines of evidence. It was the morphology of the skull, and it was also the genetic analysis as well. And I believe that other scientists are continuing to work to back that up, that determination from several years ago. And so I think as long as the scientific process is honored, then the Rice's whale will be just fine and not subject to political interference.
So what would you like listeners to come away with? What should people be doing?
I mean, there are a couple things that come to mind. One is to remind everybody something that I think we all know in our hearts, but we want to remind us. Protecting endangered wildlife is very popular among Americans. I think we know that just from our own interests and, talking to our friends and the things that we do. But the polling is very clear on this. I mean, it's not even close. It's not even close to 50-50. It's more like 85% support endangered species and support the Endangered Species Act and want to protect our wildlife and don't want animals or plants, for that matter, to go extinct because of our action. So support for that is very strong, which means this action taken by the Endangered Species Committee is a very unpopular one. The strategy I think we're really using is just to try to make sure that members of Congress, our elected officials, are really aware of how much people on the Gulf Coast love these animals and support these wildlife, and they do not support this decision that was made by the administration. I think at this point we don't feel like necessarily we're going to change the mind of that committee that met, but members of Congress are much more directly attributable to the people, especially in an election year. And so they're sensitive to that, and our hope is that by making sure our elected officials know how strongly we support endangered species and how this is an unpopular decision, that they'll convey that to the White House in various means, whether that's letters or just informal communications or whatever. But we've got to make sure that they know how unpopular this decision is and how much we do support our endangered wildlife.
In fact, just go outside, look around on the cars, and you'll see how many turtle plates there are and how many manatee plates there are. People love their Gulf wildlife.
It's very true, and I think some of the economic interests that may push back on having to comply with the Endangered Species Act, I think a lot of that is really overblown, because think about the species that we deal with here in Northwest Florida. 5 species of sea turtles, for example, Gulf sturgeon. We make space for these animals, and we change a little bit of what we do, but it doesn't mean an end to our lives. It doesn't mean an end to economic development. Beach nourishment, for example, happens in the winter rather than summer. Why? Because the sea turtles are not there. In the summertime, they're there close to shore. They can get sucked up in dredges. They can get hurt. That has, in fact, happened before. That's an easy example of that there, how we change things. We have slowdown zones for manatees, right? No-wake zones for manatees in places. For Gulf sturgeon that are migrating up our bays and into our rivers, they make sure that the permitting of things like docks and bridge construction and things have to take that into account. So we just make a little space. We account for these animals, but it doesn't mean an end to our economy by any means.
In fact, the oil and gas industry, one of the things they have to do, or they used to have to do, is have spotters out there so they don't hit whales and they don't use seismic equipment when the whales are in the area. It hasn't stopped them to this point. It just maybe is a little bit of an inconvenience.
Yeah, and the really interesting thing about the argument made by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth that somehow using the courts, which again, there's a reason our founding fathers, there's a balance of power, right? To keep one particular branch of government, we have legislative, judicial, executive, keep one from becoming too powerful. Very smart way to design it. And so we do have the courts, and every great movement in our nation's history has used the courts as part of one tool in the toolbox. It's not the only one. And sometimes that's the only place you can go to redress your grievances. And so with the environmental groups, and by default, it's millions of members, of their members and supporters around the country that support endangered species. What we're doing is just using that tool that our founders gave us to keep another branch from acting illegally. And in many cases, various administrations, including this one, are found in a court of law. Once the emotion is taken away and we're just looking at the law, they're found to take actions that are illegal. And that's why we have the court system doing that. So this is our constitutional right to do this. Our nation is better when we are able to do this. And we're simply, exerting that right to do that by going to court. And that in no way threatens the oil and gas industry. And in fact, it's difficult to find many real instances where the oil and gas industry in the Gulf has really been restrained. I mean, they have to do some mitigation. As you mentioned, they'd spot for wildlife, do some things seasonally and whatever, but it's difficult to find, even with all the lawsuits and the litigation, trying to limit some of it. It has made it happen a little safer than maybe it would happen otherwise, but it's really difficult to find examples where they're being stopped and not able to do the things that they want to do.
Absolutely. We have plenty of oil and gas industry in the Gulf.
I mean, there's thousands of rigs and platforms. There's a couple hundred that are active. A lot of those are abandoned. And in fact, it's chaos out there. It's absolute chaos out there with a bunch of junk that they've left behind, and the government has not made them clean it up. But it's very difficult to find instances that are truly being kept from doing, getting to the stuff they want to get to.
I agree. Well, Christian, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
If there's a topic you've heard on the EcoMinute that you'd like me to examine in more detail, or an environmental issue that you'd like to learn more about, email me at ecominute@wuwf.org. And for more information, go to wuwf.org/eco.